So after World War II, the U.S. booms. I mean, just an incredible economic boom. And I think we had talked about, uh, the public, architects, planners, government officials, they all were looking to the future because the past was pretty depressing. You had World War II, you had the Depression. Many people could still remember World War I. And so there was this attitude that there is a new dawn in America and in the world, and we are going to create a whole new way of living. The automobile, which had been, by this time very well established, was affordable to just about everyone, and you could buy a car, you could live in a new house in a suburban development out of the crowded, noisy, crime-infested, dirty cities, and drive your car from your garage in your house to the parking lot of your new office building in a suburban development. And you could do it on these, high-speed freeways that connected the cities and the suburbs all together. And so we have a massive, massive shift in planning and development that occurs in this post-war boom, what we call suburbia and sprawl. And a lot of things, a lot of bad things happen out of that as well. We talked about, there's a abandonment of cities, almost literally, especially as desegregation takes hold and African Americans can move out of their own slum neighborhoods that they've been forced to live in and live anywhere they want to. That spurs a white flight of white families, fleeing the city to the suburban cities, and there are other reasons than that, but it leaves the cities left with a high level of poverty and decay that it takes decades to recover from, and some cities have never really fully recovered from that. And where many of these people are fleeing to is developments like Levittown, New York. This starts in 1948. As soon as construction can begin again, as the material restrictions and so forth are lifted after World War II, we start to see this just massive development of suburban housing that continues today. I mean, more and more farm fields and forests get gobbled up for these suburban developments. And this is the first Levittown. There are many, many more, and there's these. It just represents these massive home builders that build on an industrial scale. And we saw that a little bit in the 1920s, especially with the bungalow neighborhoods in Chicago. A lot of a developer might buy a block or two and build a series of bungalows, most of which looked almost alike, and it was almost a mass-produced type of housing, but on a much smaller scale. But in the post-war period, it's exponential beyond anything that was done in the 1920s, where they're not buying up a block and developing a couple of blocks of houses. They develop acres and acres and acres, hundreds of acres for these brand new suburban developments. And they're all cookie cutter type houses with garages in the front, because you got to have a garage for your automobile, and these wide streets, no alleys. So you have these houses set on wide lawns with deep backyards that create a more bucolic setting for people to live in, which is appealing if if you've been living in a dense urban neighborhood and your view is into a light court 10 feet away is a brick wall from you, and the garbage is sitting out back and so forth. There is an appeal of why people wanted to live like this, but it grows in such a scale that it eventually gets out of hand. This is just an aerial view of what some people refer to as dead worm development. These curved streets and dead-end cul-de-sacs that just sprawl out across the landscape like dead worms. And it's all dependent on these major arterial roadways that can be 4, 5, 6, 7 lanes wide, and that handles the majority of traffic. And so the idea is that on these residential streets and on these cul-de-sacs, you get very little traffic, and so the kids can ride their bikes out on the in the street in front, and they're safe, and that's great. But as it continues, we see more and more traffic, and you know, if cities were known for traffic jams, and that was one reason for people to flee them, well, then suburbans soon after, within a couple decades, become known for traffic jams, and it leads to other environmental damage and, you know, global warming and things like that as well, that we're only really fully beginning to understand and having to address and deal with. And it completely eliminates the ability of pedestrian amenities. Whereas in an urban environment, you can usually walk out your door, and in a few blocks, you might have a shop or a library or post office that you can go to, or at least some sort of public transportation that can get you there. But in this, you have to have an automobile. And so, you know, you get in your car. If you live here and you want to go to the school or the shopping center here, you know, by the crow's distance, it's a short walk. And in a city, no one would think twice about making that kind of walk. But you have to follow this winding, curving road. You'd have to cross a 4 or 5 lane highway with traffic roaring by. And then you'd have to pass through a wide open parking lot to get to the actual building itself. So, you know, it's very rare for people to walk in these kinds of communities, which has the downside that it, you know, contributes to, you know, the health issues that we have in this country today, and it isolates people. If you can't get out, seniors and those with mobility impairments, if you can't get out into the city and walk around and be, you know, passing your neighbors and so forth, there is an impact that has on us as a community and as people. And here, you know, in Chicago, a great example is the Circle Interchange. I think it's now been renamed the Jane Byrne Interchange or something like that. But this dates from the 1960s. This is part of the interstate highway system that started under President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And it's these massive multi-lane, you know, limited access highways that connect cities, but they also connect suburbs to the cities. And this, you know, all these people moving to the suburbs, they now want to drive to their job in the downtown. And so we have to build these massive freeways and expressways for them to do that, which demolishes large swaths of land, which is going to lead partly to the counter movement, the preservation movement. But I want to point out with the Circle Interchange, which is now being rebuilt, by the way, as you've probably noticed if you try to get into the loop on the Eisenhower, look at the amount of land and territory that just one interchange takes. You know, in order, you don't have a square, you know, with a square intersection with a traffic light. You have to have all these ramps and loop-de-loops and so forth to get, you know, traffic to move fairly freely. And if you look at this on a map, especially, look at the amount of land territory that it takes to do the Circle Interchange. Compare that to the loop. It's a huge chunk equivalent of the loop. And so that's how much almost waste, you can argue, that this type of urban planning creates, is massive amounts of land that are dedicated just to traffic and not to buildings and housing and offices and restaurants and so forth. And another post-war movement in urban planning is based on the Plan Voisin for Paris from 1925 by Le Corbusier. I mentioned this very briefly before, and at the time that Corbu created this in 1925, he meant it mostly as a joke, right? You know, he did not take seriously the idea that we would just totally wipe out a huge swath of the right bank of Paris and build these massive residential towers. But in the post-war America, we didn't take that as a joke. We take it literally. And this was the solution to very real issues, urban issues that we had, of, you know, neighborhoods that have been disinvested for decades, and especially the African American neighborhoods, which, you know, face, you know, the racial segregation and the racial disinvestment that you know, happened, you know, for throughout our entire American history. And so there were very real problems with slum housing, tenement housing, and buildings that were crumbling and needed work and renovation, or in some cases maybe just needed to be rebuilt. But the solution by planners of the 1950s and 60s was to take a bulldozer, wipe out the entire neighborhood, and build Corbusier's Plan Voisin vision as these new massive housing complexes. And to a certain extent, they worked in that they provided modern, clean, decent housing for people who had been living in slums. And in the earliest days, people actually liked it. They were happy to finally get a modern apartment that they could move into, and so forth. But it came at a huge cost. By wiping out whole neighborhoods, they broke apart the neighborhood social structure that had existed, that binds people together, and it began to isolate people in these towers. And you no longer really had much connection with your neighbors, because at best you might see somebody in the elevator, and that's about it. The kids might play out in the garden, in the park around it, but you didn't walk down the street because there's no more streets. You didn't go to your neighborhood grocery or whatever because it's been torn down. You have to now drive to a grocery store in a remote location. And it's trying to take the suburban development idea and apply it to cities. And it took a few decades for us to realize that that was really devastating to the social fabric of cities, not to mention to the architectural fabric. And so here is one of the most famous. This is the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis. Minoru Yamasaki is a very respected, well-known modernist architecture. This is from 1954. And we can see the idea is to create this park-like setting with these modern buildings where people, can live and thrive. But in our next slide, we'll see starting in 1972 that they tore this entire complex down. Thing didn't even last 20 years, and they had to tear it down. Why? Because a number of reasons. The public housing did not put enough money into these buildings, and so there were design issues and material issues that were cut out because of limited funds. Wasn't necessarily Yamasaki's fault. He had very little to work with, and then there was almost no maintenance budget, and so these buildings began to decline quickly, and they didn't get maintained, and it very quickly became vertical slums for poor people. Gangs could easily block off and control a building because you only had a few access points. You had one or two elevators that gang members and criminals could, keep a watch out. And, if the police tried to come around, they'd say, hey, police are coming. And they can, swoosh away. And there aren't the grid of streets where people are out and about so much and so forth. And so it really soon became a slum in and of itself. And the most dramatic here was Pruitt-Igoe, which, like I say, didn't even last 20 years. And we had the same problem in Chicago. Especially down what we kind of call the State Street corridor, which paralleled the Dan Ryan Expressway and State Street. And we had housing project after housing project, Robert Taylor's, Stateway Gardens, and so forth. And all of them failed because of these reasons. And almost all of them have been torn down. Here's a photo of the Robert Taylor homes early on. And like I said, when these were first built, the African American community, which is where most of these, these projects were built for, they were happy. They got modern housing, but the investment didn't follow up. And so the buildings quickly declined. And many people said it became like a prison in and of itself. You saw a lot more chain link and fencing to kind of close off the riffraff, but it also closed in the residents, and a high concentration of poverty. And very soon these became slums and magnets for gangs and drugs that especially boomed in the 1980s with the crack epidemic. And so most of these got torn down. Dearborn Homes on the south side from Hollywood and Root from 1949. This survived mostly because the buildings were a little smaller scale. They had been built in a better quality to begin with. And so in let's see, when was that done? In the 2010s, actually, so pretty recently, they were totally renovated and continue to serve as public housing, but on a much lower scale and with a little better quality. But we've seen the disbursement of that mass suburban development that occurred in that post-war period. Okay, I'm going to stop here.